are these people?
Roughly 3 weeks ago, we had, I'm sure everyone's aware of the crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. There's no clean water whatsoever. But it's basically death row for a population of 83% Black people. This is essentially some form of environmental racism going on here. Uh, so Biden declared an emergency, a quote unquote emergency, for Jackson, Mississippi.
Right.
But there's little details and there's little terminology that kind of like dictates the amount of federal funding and the amount of like longevity to the amount of federal assistance that they get. So
gotcha.
Back in 2008, we had a very
and when
similar
a message
situation
is
going
urgent,
on. A Democratic president, a Republican governor, and then an entire city without any sort of clean water.
Yeah.
That picture of Obama, the water sipping thing is a classic. I mean, that's part of like what this video is right now. But just draw some comparisons here, kind of like prep up to.
So you got this video from Michael Moore. I'm going to run that one real quick. And action.
urgent enough, sometimes help arrives.
City of Flint, USA, May 5th, 2016. POTUS has arrived.
The people of Flint had one last beacon of hope.
We were all invited to this big thing where the President Obama was going to speak to us about the problem.
Oh my gosh, this is so cool! Oh yes! Oh yes!
It's finally here. We've been waiting. Once he can make a conscious decision to push this with urgency.
While President Obama was on his way to the event, Governor Snyder thought he'd take to the stage and warm up the crowd.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I understand why you're angry and frustrated.
Not like we do.
I want to come here today to apologize.
It's too late. It's too late. It's too late. We already sick.
We have a short-term water crisis that needs to be repaired.
Thank you for caring for us, Obama. Flint's recovery is everybody's responsibility. And I'm going to make sure that responsibility is met. That's why I'm here. To tell you directly that I see you and I hear you. We invest. Can I get some water? Come on up here. I want a glass of water.
Get a bottle. Bottle water.
I want a glass of water. Everybody settle down. This is a feisty crowd. Thank you. I really did need a glass of water. This is not a stunt.
What? He wet his lips.
Sure it wasn't a stunt.
Wet his lips.
There was an audible gasp in the audience. People were just like absolutely dejected. Why would you do that?
I am sure that somewhere when I was 2 years old, I was taking a chip of paint, tasting it, and I got some lead.
Yeah, that's like talking about like, well, I didn't wear a seatbelt and I'm fine. It's like, but there were tons of people that died.
Backstage, the president, sitting at the table with the criminal governor, decided to perform his stunt all over again.
You know, generally I have not been doing stunts here, but, you know.
That's not what I expected.
God.
That's what Snyder did.
It felt like he minimized like what people were actually going through and struggling with. If you were actually lead poisoned, you would not be president, you would be janitor Barack Obama.
We were holding on to hope that he would declare a disaster area. A disaster would give us FEMA, it would give us pipe replacement, get engineers in here. Then we could get Medicare for all the residents of Flint. As soon as he took a drink of the water and said everything's fine, that was that.
And look at it, years later, it's still poison.
When he came here, he was my president, but when he left, he was not my president.
I would again go back to the president's visit last week. He reinforced the message that filtered water has been determined to be safe for people to drink.
This again was our hero, and we thought he was going to come here and help us. But they do have a mural of him, and you ride past it now and his head is busted out.
It was devastating, and it depressed the vote. And I know people that stayed home and just said to hell with all of them.
And I don't know. I just don't. I don't know.
But
I don't know why. I don't know why anybody would have advised him to do that, and I don't know why he would do it.
And to the average person, then the Democrats don't look like the people who are going to come to the rescue.
Right.
So in Flint, the number is something like 8,000 African American voters who voted twice for Obama chose not to vote.
Hillary lost.
In Michigan, by 2 votes per precinct on average. 2 votes per precinct. 10,000 and some votes was it. So where are we left?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can really notice the terminology there, and like especially what that woman said. It had Obama declared it a state of a disaster as opposed to a state of emergency, which he did. They would have gotten several more. I think it even includes something along the lines of like free housing for 18 months. It's like insane, but like there, it's more longer term. There's way more involved. Yeah,
sorry. Wrong button.
Flint has been a crisis for several years, and it's looking more and more like you can expect the same out of Jackson, Mississippi. Don't expect this to get fixed anytime soon because it's not. And part of it is politically motivated, where, of course, you know, Obama is and both Biden in this case, they're directly competing with Republican governors who are kind of like seen as like the spearheads of the state. And, you know, they don't want to do anything too radical or too anything that actually like helps, because in that case they lose their seat, especially in a midterm cycle.
Yeah.
So
this was published September 20th, so literally a couple days ago. High rates of depression and PTSD found in Flint 5 years after water crisis. So just in case you still thought that was dealt with, it's still having massive scars of that community. So, and probably still is, since they still don't necessarily have clean water. So, you know,
and it's almost a decade later. It's been way too long like this.
Yeah.
And I know this, the Jackson, Mississippi crisis is relatively new, but
yeah.
Where's the help? No one is coming to save you. No one is there.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
And this is the quote unquote like wars over water. This is just post capitalism and that's what it does. It destroys infrastructure because it only benefits large companies, and then as soon as no one has any clean water, they're just not going to do anything about it. They'll toss you a bone, but
yeah. So this is from
it's from 2016.
Yeah,
but it's talking about this very concept of why disaster declaration is way radically different than an emergency declaration.
Okay. And it's from the Harvard Environmental Law Review. So in January 2016, Rick Snyder appealed to the federal government for a $96 million emergency aid grant in response to the tremendous and growing public health crisis in Flint, Michigan. City and state officials caused the crisis. They decided to switch the city's drinking water from Lake Huron to the Flint River, but failed to add the proper anti-corrosion treatment to the lead pipes that distribute water to the city's 100,000 residents. The decision caused the lead to leach from the pipes, ultimately poisoning all who drank the city's waters. Governor Snyder's request was not only for funds, but for President Obama to declare that the crisis in Flint was legally a disaster, a prerequisite for such an allocation of money and for eligibility for certain government programs. The headline of an article in the Detroit News shortly after Snyder's request read, "Obama gives $80 million to Michigan for Flint." Though it sounds helpful, the headline is misleading. So Obama declared a federal emergency in Flint, but not a disaster. The Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act of 1988 was enacted to support state and local governments and their citizens when disasters overwhelm them. The act outlines the process to receive a presidential disaster declaration that would activate an array of federal programs to assist in the response and recovery effort. Governor Snyder's request for such a presidential disaster declaration was denied. He appealed the decision immediately, only for it to be denied again 2 days later. So a disaster is defined in the Stafford Act as a natural catastrophe, which, in the determination of the president, causes damage of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant major disaster assistance. An emergency, a broader designation, is defined as any occasion or instance for which federal assistance is needed to supplement state and local efforts and capabilities to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety. Because the crisis in Flint was man-made and not a natural catastrophe, it could only fall for the emergency category. Therefore, Flint received the maximum grant of aid for federal emergencies, $5 million.
Yeah, like typically, like an emergency declaration is supposed to be strictly for natural disasters like hurricanes.
Like after a hurricane or an earthquake or flood or
But this is a government-made disaster. This was constructed through policy.
Right.
This is no natural. You can't say this is natural shit going on right now.
Yeah. So because the crisis in Flint was man-made and not a natural catastrophe, it could only fall into emergency category. Right, we read that. So the $5 million emergency allocation has been used in part by FEMA to provide water and water filters to households in Flint, initially only for 90 days, but later extended to August by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to disseminate public health information, and by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to review the state of Michigan's compliance with the National Safe Drinking Water Act, even though citizens have been advised not to drink the water until further notice, a period that will likely exceed FEMA's water supply provision even after it was extended. These programs are positive and potentially impactful, albeit a far cry from the initially requested aid to begin vital infrastructure repair. The $80 million received in the Detroit News headline was an allocation in the last year's congressional budget. Congress originally intended the $80 million allocation to be loaned out to Michigan for water distribution infrastructure repair. President Obama made the funds available immediately when Snyder made his request, but as a loan, one initially intended for the entire state, not an emergency allocation, which would be available with a disaster designation. In March, Snyder tried once more to appeal the denial, this time asking FEMA to reconsider its denial and to fund several specific programs. The governor invoked the language of the Stafford Act and explained in his appeal later that the incident is of such severity and magnitude that effective recovery is out of the state and local government's reach, and that the federal relief assistance is undeniably needed to address the unmet needs of those most severely affected by the water contamination. In his letter, Snyder noted that the crisis will cause a 4% average decrease in personal income overall amongst Flint residents, equivalent to $115 million loss to the local economy per year. State law requires that the state's emergency fund money, which has limitations on how much can be granted to individual jurisdictions, be used for incident-related response operations. It can be used to reimburse individual home or business owners, a necessary step to make up the residents' economic losses. In contrast, Stafford Act funds could go directly to disaster relief organizations who could reimburse individuals to compensate their losses. These losses, however, must be disaster related, right? So, similarly, in declared disasters, HHS will fund programs to provide temporary prescription assistance for disaster survivors. An AHS program like this could have been used in Flint to provide blood tests for each resident exposed to the lead-contaminated water, but because what happened in Flint is not a disaster under law, Stafford Act funds for these programs were again denied. In its response to Syndex's letters, FEMA repeated its rationale for its original denial. Additional Stafford Act assistance is not appropriate for this kind of event. The disaster designation is not an absolute requirement to receive more federal aid. Congress could introduce or amend a bill to allocate aid to Flint. Already, Michigan's delegation has proposed 2 such measures. In February, Democratic Congressman Dan Kildee introduced the Families of Flint Act, a bill that proposes $765 million be allocated from the federal government and then matched by the state of Michigan for a variety of programs, including infrastructure repair, services for families and children exposed to lead, economic development, and a health monitoring program. The bill is ambitious. If passed in its current form, the bill would fund a center of excellence on lead exposure in Flint for medical experts to conduct research and monitor the crisis, and programs to address problems expected in Flint's future, such as juvenile delinquency and unemployment. At the end of March, the bill was still in committee. So, in the Senate, the amendments proposed by the Bipartisan Energy and Policy Modernization Act of 2015 by Michigan Democratic Senators Gary Peters and Debbie Stabenow would allocate $600 million in aid for infrastructure repair and investment in health programs in Flint. The amendment has faced opposition by Republicans who fear setting the precedent of granting federal aid for local programs. Their opposition, or at least the opposition by Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn, is hypocritical.
Cornyn, yeah.
Cornyn, yeah.
Cornyn.
No M. Cornyn.
Yeah. Think of the Y as an I.
Yeah. That right there. But Senator Cornyn appealed the federal government denial of an emergency designation and grant of federal aid to his home state after an explosion in a fertilizer plant killed 15 people and was successful. Michigan senators have used the Texas story as a reminder to Republicans to be consistent and allow for further funding for Flint. At the end of March, the Senate had yet to come to a vote on the bill. Flint's disaster was man-made, making it clearly outside of the scope of the legal definition of a disaster. But should the definition be expanded, or should exceptions like this one made for the fertilizer plant be more common? A terrible mix of the emergency manager law, poor leadership, and an economically depressed community and crumbling infrastructure led to Flint's crisis. Those last 2 factors, however, are commonplace. There are dozens of Flints sprinkled throughout the Midwest and across the country. Once small to medium, working-class cities often fueled by a single industry, they are now small and shrinking. Cities sitting on the bones of what was built by an industry that is now long gone. The bridges, roads, and pipes in these cities are old and in need of repair. What happened in Flint should be viewed as a cautionary tale, not a bellwether, but with the current state of many American cities, it is possible for similar disasters to happen elsewhere. Expanding the law would provide a fairer and more uniform process for all cities to receive the necessary aid, regardless of how much influence the representatives have to push for a disaster designation, especially now that the nation has an example in Flint of how far-reaching and devastating a non-natural disaster can be. Congress should amend the law to provide a better response to the next Flint, or better yet, take action now to prevent such crises from occurring.
And then we saw how that turned out, right?
Yeah, it didn't happen, and now we're stuck with Jackson being the way it is. So,
yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, standard
it's
stuff.
Clear that this is going to be a commonplace thing. This is more so like a warning to people who are not like familiar, but this is like this is a strategic tactic.
I mean, Warren wants to point out
something to make it appear as if they're doing something, but really not
anything
at all. Then even when there's an emergency declaration, all of the cost is burdened on the working class. you could see how their economy is affected by, because it's based on a state level as opposed to a federal level.
Yeah.
And so they require like certain funding and taxes, whatever. But
well, and Mississippi is run by good old boys, as Warren would like to put it. Which means, people of color and the poor are going to get shit on.
Exactly.
You know?
Both of these towns, both Flint and Jackson, are 80% plus African American, and they're all poor. Everyone is poor.
Yeah, I mean it's long since the days of Huey P. Long and his Share the Wealth clubs.
Yeah, and it really depends on like it seems more like to me that it just straight up environmental racism, because you don't see this happening in rather more affluent towns or cities.
Remind me what happened with Huey P. Long again? Oh, I think there's a bullet hole somewhere in New Orleans that might tell you. Anyway,